good afternoon, good morning to everybody, depending on where you are joining us from. And I'd also like to welcome you in my mother tongue, which is South African, isiXhosa, and say, Botani mawethu, siyavuya kakhulu unibona. My name is Khanyisi Lenzenge. I am the project manager for the Jobs Fund project. And this webinar that you've joined today is titled Emerging ESG and Impact Practice in Africa. This webinar is brought to you by the 27-4 Academy. So we are holding this webinar because we see that there's a growing expectation and requirements of investors and other stakeholders, as well as the pace at which the field of impact and ESG are evolving, mean that 27-4 and the funds in which we invest are needing to expand understanding of ESG and impact, and to be more intentional about the way that these elements are driven across respective investment cycles. In order to help us think about impact and ESG, we have enlisted the assistance of Ibis, who will be presenting today's webinar. So Ibis is a premier emerging market sustainability consultancy that assists private and public companies to unlock value and improve their environmental and social performance. I'll brag on behalf of Ibis for them and say that Ibis was a recipient of Sustainability Consultancy of the Year, South and East Africa in 2019 by MEA Markets UK. It received the Due Diligence Firm of the Year 2019 by M&A Today UK, and it received the Independent Advisor of the Year Award 2018 by Africa Global Funds US. So before I introduce our two speakers, I would just like to cover a few housekeeping topics. So today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be available to you after the event, which a link will be shared with you. Please feel free to revisit the content yourself and to share it widely with your networks and your colleagues. We also invite you to post comments and any questions that you might have. So if you look at the bottom of the Zoom web application, there should be a Q&A section. So please pose your questions there, and I will pose these questions to Kenny and Sarah as we go along with the presentation, and at the end of presentation where we should have a discussion session. So back to our presenters and Ibis. So Sarah is Ibis's Principal Impact Specialist. She has developed impact management strategies and frameworks for a number of African funds and has supported clients with integrating these into investment and reporting processes. She participates in key impact leadership activities and forums within the region. Kenny heads up the Ibis Strategy and Systems team. He supports impact investors, private equity and debt funds, and financial institutions to be more strategic about how they incorporate ESG and impact into day-to-day activities and their investment processes. He has worked extensively with both local and international clients across a wide variety of different asset classes, including two of the largest asset managers in South Africa. I trust this gives you comfort that you are in very good hands. So at this point, I'm going to hand over the floor to our first speaker, who is Kenny. Kenny, your floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kanisile. Thanks for the kind words, and it's an honor for us to be involved in this initiative, and thanks for including us. Yeah. Sarah, just go to the next slide. I think, you know, really for us, the objectives of today's session is to take you through some of the emerging trends that we've seen in our work, you know, predominantly in Africa, to look at some of the sort of ESG and impact concepts. We know how confusing these can be, and we'll try and take you through some of those and the interconnections that we see between the two. We'll take you through some of the key frameworks and guidelines that we've seen being used in the space, and then try and bring that back to practice in terms of how we see people adopting these and some of the practices that are evolving, and also linking that to some specific case studies that we worked on with clients of ours. Kanisile touched on this, and I don't think we need to spend too much time on it. Just to say that we are providing services across the sort of investment life cycle, right from upfront sort of strategy type work with new funds and also funds that are looking to reposition themselves within the market. Also other FIs like banks. We do a lot of work with, as you can see from our clients, with development finance institutions who have been driving a lot of this practice in Africa and other emerging markets for quite a long time. We're also working with international and national type fund managers, both private equity funds and private debt, and also other sort of asset classes like your microfinance and fintech type companies, predominantly providing services within the alternatives private market space. And with that, I'll hand over to Sarah just to take you through some of the key concepts.
Great. Thanks so much, Kenny. And just to echo Kenny's sentiments, I'm delighted to be here today and speaking to you all and looking forward to some tough questions at the end. So, I mean, ultimately, all we're trying to say here is that, as Kenny said, we know this is a really convoluted space full of lots of jargon, ethical investing, responsible investing, value add, impact, ESG. So what we're hoping to do here is simplify this a little bit. But just to say that this whole sort of movement around ethical investing, which was, you know, really grounded in values around where people wanted to put their money, started in the 1960s and has developed since then. In the early 2000s, we start to see more concepts around ESG and particularly ESG performance entering the scene. And the space where we're finding ourselves in now is really a space where these concepts of ESG and impact are kind of more and more integrated, where we're seeing our clients and other stakeholders kind of taking a more intentional and more focused approach on what is most material and important to them from an ESG and impact point of view, and kind of being quite clear and articulate about the way that you know, environmental and social and governance considerations might either protect or drive value for their organizations, and the way that, you know, their specific products and services or those of the companies in which they invest might create impact for external stakeholders. So we really are seeing a move from a sort of values-based system through a compliance-based system now into a much more holistic focus on what is most material. We talk about, as I said, you know, again, complex space and distinction between ESG and impact. We also recognize here that there is a lot of crossover between the two. So where we see ESG it is really a finance sector term, and it focuses a lot more on kind of commercial and financial value. What it thinks about is kind of the value protection piece. So that's around risk mitigation and avoiding negative impact. And also the value creation piece around elements particularly linked to ESG. And where that crosses over with impact is that impact also thinks about value creation, sometimes for internal stakeholders in a business, but also around, you know, what positive impact or what contribution to solutions can be created externally of the organization. So what other stakeholders feel the impact of the work of that particular company, and what is the nature of that impact. Here what we've got is also just another way of showing essentially that these themes are all kind of interconnected and there's a lot of crossover between the two. What we've got is, starting on the far left there, is, you know, what we see to be quite traditional investment that doesn't really consider negative outcomes for people and planet. It's really about kind of driving financial returns and not much more than that. We then start moving into the responsible space, which is where we think about avoiding harm and mitigating risks, through to the sustainable and impact-driven space where we think about our internal and external stakeholders. And then finally, on the far right there is philanthropy. So this talks about, you know, on that end of the spectrum, you either are accepting a full loss of capital or a partial loss of capital in order to drive impact. And I think the big point that we wanted to make here is just, you know, just to point out the overlap in these spaces and to just particularly look at that avoid harm piece and just show how that runs across the full end of the spectrum. So to say that, you know, what I guess we have seen a lot in the recent past is lots of talk about impact, lots of talk about positive outcomes. And our strong sense is that although that is possible and important, what we can't forget is that, you know, you risk eroding those positive impacts if you don't think about managing your risks and avoiding harm in an intentional way as well. So I think just showing that avoid harm and mitigating risk line to run all the way through is an important note to make. This is another kind of sort of way of showing the journey, I suppose, to where we are now. But ultimately, again, just making the point that, you know, starting out from a values-based or ethical investing point of view, moving through this compliance space, and now ultimately into impact. Really what we're seeing is organizations being very clear about what issues are most material to them and what issues are most material to their stakeholders, what things are ultimately going to impact their business in the short, medium, and long term, and what is most important to their stakeholders. And again, important just to link this with financial performance. So I think, you know, I think often these terms can be quite separate, but ultimately what we're seeing more and more is the kind of integration of financial and commercial considerations with ESG and impact considerations. And ultimately, you know, our sense is that if you do all of these things well and intentionally and do focus on what is material, that the commercial and ESG impact performance are very closely interlinked. So in this very complicated space, what many of you will know or have seen is the plethora of frameworks, guidelines, and principles that have kind of flooded the space and continue to do so. And although this is really positive in that it obviously highlights how topical and important ESG and impact considerations are, and how front of mind they are to stakeholders across the space, what it does make for is a very confusing and messy place to work and find one's way, and often what you know, quite a difficult situation of working out what is most relevant for a particular fund or institution. So what we've done here is we've separated some of the frameworks that we see most often into three broad categories. The first are those that help determine one's management approach and the way that one evaluates impact and ESG performance. The IFC performance standards perhaps being the most well established and well accepted of all of these. And this really is much more of a kind of ESG framework that is used. From an impact point of view, we've seen a lot of traction gained by the Impact Management Project, which is really kind of a centralizing force in trying to gather and consolidate developments being made in the impact space. The operating principles for impact management are guidelines initially set out by the IFC, but which contain 9 principles that essentially guide how an investor should incorporate impact into the work that they do. And the SDG standards do this in a similar way, but in a slightly more rigorous way, and one that is very centered around the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Again, goals, metrics, and targets, there are a range of, you know, of standards here. And I think there is a really positive move. We've seen some developments in some more collaboration amongst these different stakeholders, which I think is really positive and will hopefully make our lives easier in the future. Again, some of these a lot more ESG focused than impact focused, but all of which are of course very useful. Our experience is that often one ends up with a combination of these, that it's seldom that, you know, one standard is a perfect fit for an organization. Often it kind of takes cherry picking from each of these and potentially some more to get the, you know, the right range of indicators to talk about performance. And then obviously they're topic specific frameworks. So examples that we've used here are, you know, some really well established frameworks around gender, around labor, and around climate. But that's to say that if an investor has a specific focus around one of these themes, there are also frameworks that guide the sort of strategy and measurement around the achievement of objectives regarding these themes. So agenda, we've here got the 2X challenge. For labor, we've got the ILO, and particularly the ILO decent work agenda. And then for climate, we're seeing a lot of traction being gained by the TCFDs, which support organizations in incorporating climate considerations into the way that they think and work and measure performance. I think really to say here again, this is from the Global Impact Investing Network survey, which sought to kind of try and understand who's using what frameworks. What we do see here and amongst our clients as well is that the SDGs do tend to be the most widely adopted of all of them. I think that is because they are really well established and understood and well recognized, and quite accessible for a broad audience. I think our challenge that we see with the SDGs is that it's not always easy to apply to a private sector context. And then just to show that there are a range of other standards and tools being used. So, you know, we acknowledge that it's certainly not a one size fits all space, but just also recognizing that the SDGs are still the most widely adopted and widely used of these.
I think just to add on the frameworks piece, Sarah, I think what's interesting to note is that we are seeing instances where clients don't necessarily fully adopt a standard. So, you know, for example, the GRI or reporting framework, they're not necessarily fully adopting the standard, but more cherry picking what is applicable for their specific context. So looking at what is material to the fund, depending on the types of investments they are making, the types of sectors and geographies they're in, and looking at what parts of those standards or frameworks apply to them and which could be used most effectively to meet the objectives that they're setting.
100%. Perfect. So just before I hand over to Kenny, just to think about, you know, some key takeaways, really what we see to be important and what we're seeing in the market more broadly is just how important it is to prioritize what is most material for you as an investor, from an opportunity and an impact, from a risk and opportunity and impact perspective. And a lot of this will be based on your sort of unique operating context, whether that's geography, sector, type of financing, etc. And we'll get into some examples of that a little bit later. And then I think there's a piece around, you know, how well positioned are you to manage these risks and maximize these impacts. And then also just how important it is to align yourself where possible with national and international standards and priorities. So, you know, as I said, globally, perhaps the SDGs being the best accepted. Locally, we do still see the use of the National Development Plan and NTSF framework a lot. And then finally, what's critical is to be sort of practical and think carefully around, once you've identified what's important, what does that look like in practice, and how does one integrate that into the daily work of the organization, which again, we've got some examples of later on, which we'll talk to shortly.
Sarah, before sorry, Kenny, before you pass by, I think we have a question here, and I think you might have just answered it, but let's just pose it in case you have a different answer. Which standards would you then recommend, if not the SDGs?
So I think that it really would, I mean, keen to hear Kenny's point of view on this as well. I think it depends so much on the unique context of the organization. So it would depend so much on, you know, what type of investor they are, where they're operating, what sectors they invest in, what their sort of impact or ESG priorities are. And I'm certainly not advocating against the SDGs. I think that they are like a fantastically useful framework to use. So I'm certainly not saying that the SDGs shouldn't be used, but it's difficult for me to give a steer without understanding the nature of the investor.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that, Sarah. I think we're not advocating for not using the SDGs. There's been amazing industry buy-in and around these, and they are a really good framework. It's just a case of sometimes when you look at the sort of practical implementation on the ground, there are other frameworks that you could adopt that are more specific to your context. And then you can always overlay the SDGs on top of that. But, exactly. You know, for example, you know, the SDGs might not give you the specifics around how you drive women empowerment in a specific context, whereas the 2X challenge provides more guidance around that. So it's really about working out what is most important to your fund, what's your long-term vision, and then identifying frameworks that are aligned with that. And then, yeah, and one of those is the SDGs.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
Perfect. I'm going to hand over to Kenny.
Great.
Perfect.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to start looking at some of the sort of key trends that we've seen in our work in the space. So, you know, definitely a key element that we've seen is the importance of data. And this is both quantitative and qualitative data, especially in the impact space. We've seen definitely importance in terms of providing additional context that qualitative data can provide. So what we have seen in the past is sort of this ad hoc collection of data without any strategy or reporting or thinking about why you're collecting the data, what it's used for. What we're seeing now is a movement towards aligning the type of data that you collect with your broader strategic objectives for ESG and impact, and then also trying to link that to being able to demonstrate a certain impact narrative or articulate that a bit better, or articulate specific outcomes that you're looking to achieve through your investments or through your support that you provide to your investments. You know, through this, there's various different technologies or softwares that are being developed. There's also the use of you know, Excel is also widely used, and linking that to certain tools like that are readily available, like Microsoft BI, to help on the analysis and sort of trend analysis type thing. And then also, you know, once you are collecting that right type of data, we've seen a move towards actually using that data to start setting specific targets, whether they're quantitative or process orientated targets, but using that as a means to actually start setting specific targets that you can work towards. And also obviously difficult depending on the amount of data you're able to collect, but also starting to look at things around benchmarking. But that is also, you know, that's largely dependent on how much research there is in a specific area, and some areas are more developed than others. So, you know, but also on this piece, I think, you know, a lot of challenges still. I think we're still very early on in this sort of data process. It's a very much an iterative or evolutionary process. And takes quite a lot of time to start collecting quality data that you can actually use to inform decisions. And that is what we've seen, yeah. Also what we've seen is definitely this movement towards increased accountability for investment managers specifically. You know, in the past where we saw it was fine to have an ESG policy, and that is all your sort of investor asks of you. Now we've seen investors very much more focusing on what you're doing on the ground, and how you're implementing your policy. So, you know, you've got organizations like ILPA bringing out sort of specific guidance around the types of due diligence questions that you can expect to see from investors. And we've done a number of sort of due diligence of funds for investors, where they're not only asking the sort of basic questions around how you manage risk, but even looking beyond that to how you create value through certain ESG initiatives. And then also, what is the impact that your funds, your investments have? So I think a lot more questions being asked, and in the past when we only saw these types of questions coming from your DFI type investors, what we see now is even your more conventional sort of institutional investors asking these types of questions, which is very interesting. Then, yeah, I mean, I think we definitely seen some emerging topics that probably haven't historically been covered all that well, and this is obviously due to emerging trends, environmental trends, as well as technological trends, demographic changes. So, you know, things like climate change, which I'm sure you're very well aware of, is becoming far more prominent in our discussions with investment managers and investors. You know, very much being driven from your sort of European, American type investors, but even locally. And, you know, also coming with the certain technological advances, there are lots of issues coming up around data privacy, cybersecurity. I'm sure all of us have been affected by these in some way. You know, also some really interesting issues coming out for some of the more sort of innovative type financial products in the fintech space around these types of issues, where they're leading to other sort of ethical type concerns, or even issues around human rights and modern slavery, which is, you know, very, very interesting. The human rights and modern slavery piece is obviously very, very prominent, especially in Africa. And so that is also something that where we are seeing a lot of work being done. On the impact side of things, you know, there has been a lot of impetus placed around gender equality, gender empowerment, and especially in the South African context, we also, and in even more so in response to COVID, we've seen a lot of impetus being placed around elements around access and inclusion. So this includes both considerations around diversity in both your staff complement and the types of goods and products and services that you offer. And it also touches on things around financial inclusion. So where you're providing financial services to either beneficiaries that have historically been sort of underserved. And obviously the local economic development piece is also very strong, and we're doing a number of pieces of work around this in the South African context, where we're looking at things around local procurement, supply chain, and enterprise development, and all these types of things. You go, Sarah. I think you're on mute.
Perfect. Thanks. Sorry. Great. So just to take over from Kenny there, I think alongside everything that Kenny has said, and particularly alongside increased accountability, what we're also seeing a call for is increased transparency. So kind of historically, it might have been okay to say, we really care about gender, or we have a climate change strategy, or we have, as Kenny said, an ESG policy. I think now what we're seeing is more and more a call from stakeholders, either LPs or other external stakeholders, kind of saying, so what? Which has been a really interesting development in the market. And I think what this has led to is greater transparency around not only just people's or organizations' approaches to ESG and impact, but also the results of those. So that links to what Kenny was saying around data is, I think that, you know, it's no longer sufficient to say this is our approach to ESG and impact. What's now being required is to say this is our approach and this is what we are achieving against that intended approach. So that obviously takes multiple forms, but what we are certainly seeing is even just at a basic level, you know, on a lot more websites, you'll see this type of information, a lot of people publishing either standalone sustainability or impact reports, or even people making public their sort of policies or frameworks around how they incorporate ESG and impact into the work that they do. Another big trend we're seeing, which I guess is a necessity based on everything we've said so far, is how are these concepts of ESG and impact incorporated into the core strategy of an organization. So again, historically, it might have been sufficient to have a standalone ESG policy, but I think what people are calling for now is to say, well, you know, we'll only really know that policy or that strategy is coming to life if it really is part of the the way that an organization works and sees the world. So I think what we're seeing a lot of, both from a from a practice point of view, i.e. making it easier to do business, but also from a values point of view, is seeing the incorporation of ESG and impact into the core business strategy of organizations. So understanding, thinking carefully about what are the most material risks and opportunities based on all the things we've discussed so far around sector, geography, etc., etc. How best can the manager or investor mitigate these risks and maximize value? And again, that depends on lots of contextual factors. And then finally, how can that practically be incorporated into the daily work of the investor or of the investment manager? We see sort of two main ways of maximizing impact. So we'll talk about mitigating risk a little bit separately. But I think that the two main ways we see of maximizing impact, well, the two main stages are either before the investment is made, so thinking about the way that capital is allocated, and the other being around how you could engage with an investee post-investment. And one's ability to do that depends a lot, again, on so many factors, including what type of finance is provided and the terms of that finance. But from an allocating capital point of view, one thinks very hard about the sector that one allocates capital to. So if you have a specific focus on, for example, education or healthcare or agriculture, if you have a kind of food security focus, that's where you'd allocate your capital. Another consideration is what market are you allocating that capital to? So is the market that you're entering one that has historically not had access to whichever goods or services are being provided by that investee? And then the other is just the terms on which that capital is allocated. So, is there any capacity to be flexible around those terms or to create incentives around the achievement of specific impact objectives that are identified? And then based on the type of investor you are and the type of relationship that you have with your investees, there is sometimes room to engage post that investment to drive those opportunities even more intentionally through kind of active engagement or management. And that again takes multiple forms. It could be, it could be board positions, it could be close engagement with management, it could be, it could take multiple forms. And then another thing that we're seeing more and more of is the use of technical assistance facilities. So ultimately, setting capital aside for specific initiatives that actively seek to drive impact in an area mutually agreed by the investor and the investee. So, if there is a particular opportunity around gender, for example, there could be some capital made available for a gender equality initiative around training or something like that, or from a climate point of view, potentially around resource efficiency or more use of renewable energy, whatever it might be. So that's really what we see are the two main points or the two main ways of driving impact. Linked again to Kenny's point around data, what we are seeing over and over again is a more intentional approach to management and measurement. And this is linked to the accountability point, it's linked to the transparency point, it's linked to the data point, and it's linked to the last point that we made just around kind of post-investment engagement. But basically that, the recognition that you can't manage what you don't measure. So measuring performance being particularly important, and then using what you are able to gather from a measurement point of view to engage with stakeholders. So we always say to prove and improve. So it's talking to stakeholders about what you've done and what you've been able to achieve, but also using that information to drive performance more effectively and more efficiently based on the data that you've been able to gather. And this is something that, as I said, we're seeing amongst our clients, but this is another graph from the Global Impact Investing Network survey, where there is, again, here kind of visible growing recognition of the importance of active management and measurement of ESG and impact performance. Kenny, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I think, you know, we've been talking about how it's important to not only sort of looking at how you approach this, but also actually the practical implementation and how that leads to specific outcomes. And the challenge here is obviously that there's no silver bullet in terms of how you approach ESG or impact. There's definitely a growing recognition around a broad sort of management approach that you take, which includes sort of integration into investment analysis, you know, incorporation into legal agreements of certain clauses. There's, you know, elements around disclosures and this sort of thing. But the way that people are implementing ESG and impact in practice definitely differs significantly. Also the key thing to take into account here is often your investment strategy and what the asset class or the type of finance that you provide. Obviously, sort of in the private market space, you have differing amount of leverage post-investment to drive performance in the ESG or impact areas. So in those instances, like for example, in your private debt space, or in an instance where you sort of a minority shareholder and you have limited leverage to drive performance post-investment, your upfront investment analysis and decision making becomes incredibly important. It also becomes important to integrate ESG or impact clauses into legal agreements to increase the amount of leverage that you have post-investment, to ensure that you're collecting the right data, and also to try and drive performance where you can, or drive active management. In those other instances, there is obviously other elements that you can do around how you engage with clients or counterparties. But obviously, you know, in the private equity space, and especially when you're a majority shareholder, there is probably the most leverage that you can have. In the banking space, where you have tons of clients, then the pre-investment part, or the credit approvals process, becomes also important, and it becomes important to screen your investments effectively, to determine what are the riskiest types of products and clientele, and to then, you know, take an approach that's commensurate with that level of risk or opportunity that you see in those areas. But I mean, essentially, there's a whole lot of different tools out there, and this will depend on your sort of level of ambition that you have, the vision that you have around these elements, and then also, if or not, you know, to go back to Sarah's previous slide, if you are investing with a specific lens to allocate capital to specific things, then, you know, again, your upfront decision making and how you integrate into an investment analysis is very important. If not, you might have more of just a focus on ensuring that you're managing risk. You might have a focus on ensuring that you're managing risk and opportunities. So it really depends on the specific context. And then, so this is a really important part. So we develop a lot of systems for a variety of different clients. And, you know, some of the key barriers that we've seen in implementing these systems is around some of these areas. So, you know, these are all fairly specialist areas, or areas where people don't necessarily have expertise. So there's a lot of need to undertake sort of training, capacity building as part of embedding these systems within the organizations and ensuring that people are focusing on the right things. There's nothing worse there's nothing that erodes credibility than when you're focusing on the wrong things, or you focusing on things that are not material to the investment. Organizational capacity and competencies. So again, you know, I think in some of the riskier type investment mandates. So, you know, your investments into power, into infrastructure, into agriculture or primary agriculture, you know, there often is well, I'd say it's almost essential to have a dedicated person in-house to drive, make sure that you are focusing on the right things, that you're covering these elements effectively. And even within those situations, you will need to draw on specialist expertise to advise you on certain technical areas like climate change, like resettlement, like human rights. You know, there's never going to be one person that can do everything, but it's it's a big driver in terms of driving the successful implementation when you do have dedicated people within your funds to drive these sorts of efforts. The governance and strategic oversight is also a key aspect that we see. You know, management commitment is critical. Putting in structures that help you to oversee that from a strategy perspective is important. Engagement reporting, how you disseminate information across the organization around ESG, just like you do from a financial technical perspective. You should be giving similar rigor to ESG and impact type considerations so that you can make this core to what you're doing. We've spoken about target setting, performance review. You know, there's some of your more ambitious or mature funds are actually starting to set specific incentives around or targets for actual individuals and teams around these elements. And then obviously growing the data piece, because it's becoming more important, is leading to certain sort of technological improvements around how you collect data, how you analyze that, all of that sort of thing. Yeah, and then I think on this one, just key, you know, I think largely what's come out of this IFC's operating principles for impact management, they've developed a standard, Sarah mentioned earlier, where they've identified these principles for how you undertake impact measurement and management, and principle 9 is around this independent verification. And this has driven a lot of work in the space to verify how people are implementing this against these principles. And we've seen, you know, in Europe and America, this type of practice is growing, not only on the process side, but on the data verification side. You know, this is fairly common practice in the corporate listed space. I think that the finance space is just a little bit behind on this, but you know, it should be something that would be fairly common practice in a few years, especially for your impact funds. Okay, I know we sort of running out of time here. Celia, can we have 5 more minutes on this and then go to some questions?
That's fine, Kenny.
Okay, great, thanks. So just touching on some of the key barriers. So, you know, I think there's still some lack of understanding that we see with different teams and management around ESG and impact and how these things are linked. Also, you know, lots of gaps in data, and we get lots of questions around how do we benchmark this? How do we tell whether this performance is comparable with industry best practice or the industry benchmark? That's become even harder now in a post-COVID environment where we've seen that, you know, data that was maybe relevant, you know, a year ago is not so relevant anymore. So lots of challenges there. There is definitely a challenge around the ability to actually link. There's a lot of theoretical evidence and stuff around this, but you know, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be going into linking material issues to actual trends and commercial value that's been driven. And this is where this whole measurement piece becomes very important, and being able to really demonstrate outcomes through tracking the right type of data. focusing on the right types of elements. We still see, lack of senior management buy-in, and this is often a big driver. Historically it has been driven through investor requirements, but I think definitely on the ESG side, this is becoming very much more mainstream. And on the impact side, I think there's definitely growing interest around that. And we've seen a huge evolution in that space over even the last year or 2 years. We are still seeing lots of challenges around investors who are asking for lots of different reporting requirements, and we would love it if there was a little bit more sort of collaboration around that, especially on the ESG reporting requirements. What we are finding there is that funds that do have a good understanding of where their strategic focus is from an ESG impact perspective, they are able to actually have more of a conversation with investors around what type of data they should be tracking and what's relevant to them. So that actually helps a lot. And we've seen also a lot of instances where investors have gone in together to produce a sort of side letter that outlines a sort of combined set of ESG requirements. And then we've spoken about the fact that, there's no real one way or best way to do this. So it is leading to lots of different ways that people are doing that, although we are seeing a convergence towards a sort of generally accepted approach, both on the ESG side and the impact side. And then, I think a challenge that we've always faced in the sustainability space is this thing around, long time horizons over which ESG, things like climate change, that can materialize versus the short-term sort of incentives and interests or financial elements that funds or different stakeholders have. So I think we'll leave it there, and maybe we can go into some of the questions. If we do have any time, we can start touching on some of the case studies.
Great. Thanks, Kenny. Thanks, Sarah. So earlier in your presentation, you'd shown some specific matrices. I think some were on women, environment, and other specific matrices. Can you think of any that are health specific at the moment?
I mean, I think that's an area that has seen quite a lot of research being done. I think there's, in all likelihood, probably different frameworks for elements around access, around affordability, around quality. So I think even within that space, there might be sort of different things that you would focus on. But yeah, it's not my area of expertise either, so I wouldn't.
Yeah,
sure.
As far as I'm aware, the World Health Organization does have some sort of considerations around exactly what Kenny outlined around quality, access, and affordability. But that would be the best place to start. The other consideration is obviously, and this is the benefit of the SDGs, is within the good health and well-being goal, the sub-targets beneath that would be a really good place to start in terms of thinking about kind of more specific areas of focus beneath that health banner.
All right, thanks. The other question from Fred is, how do you undertake best impact analysis?
This is a really hard question, and as Kenny said, there really is no one size fits all. So we do a lot of impact measurement at Ibis, and to be honest, I don't think we've ever taken exactly the same approach twice. So I think that, a couple of things that I would say are important, as Kenny alluded to earlier, the combination of qualitative and quantitative information is really important when thinking about impact. I'd say the combination of monitoring and evaluation is really important when thinking about impact. So the kind of ongoing monitoring of some more of your sort of activity and output related information, and then, a deeper dive evaluation at strategic intervals. And then, yeah, go for Kenny.
Yeah. No, I think for me, always the upfront intent setting sort of strategic part is the most important, because that really sets the scene for the rest of how you implement your strategic objectives. So, you need to be thinking around, are we positioning as an impact fund? If so, we need that lens to be on the same level as how we consider sort of financial, commercial type elements. You need to be thinking about your investment strategy around the time horizons of your investment, how long it will take your impact to materialize. You need to think about the sectors that you're investing into. Are you a sector agnostic fund, which makes it a lot harder? Are you sector focused, which then you can, are you healthcare, education? What type of leverage do you have post investment to actually influence or manage impact performance based off the data that you're collecting? And then obviously, as Sarah mentions, the contribution piece is important. We always talk about contribution and attribution and impact. So, what extent of the impact can be attributed to our investment versus someone else's? How do we contribute to the end outcome or the impact? And then measurement, and aligning these with international frameworks that make sense, and also national or local priorities, and even global priorities in some extent.
Yeah. Just on that last point, I think what's ultimately the most important thing is having something to test your impact against. So as Kenny said, having an impact strategy or having frameworks or having an idea of what you ultimately want to achieve is super important if you're going to be assessing you're assessing your impact against something. So I would say that that's really important.
Sure. Another question from Tenjue wants to know, have you ever seen any kind of use of artificial intelligence in your data collection? And since ESG is not really regulated, how do you regulate data and performance?
Sure. AI. What we are seeing is sort of people tapping into other data sources that would be used already to capture sort of labor type data, that sort of thing. But that's more of like an integration with other systems. We do see, I've seen it in like sectors like agriculture, where they have sort of drones to identify health of
productivity and
there's also in the healthcare sector, there's instances where people have used drones to deliver bloods and stuff to remote areas. So I think in terms of the delivery of impact, or like the actual product or service, yes, but in our sort of day-to-day work, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so what sort of ESG trends do you expect to see post-COVID-19?
That's an interesting question.
So I think it really has highlighted the sort of the challenges we have with inequality in our societies, and it's also really put a spotlight on quite significant things and big sort of more macroeconomic like risks or pandemics that can affect society. So, I would put like sort of climate change components into that same bucket. And so I think people will be more open to sort of realizing that these things can happen and do happen. And while, you look at the World Economic Forum, it's had climate change, national pandemics, all of these things at the top of the list for the last 10 years. And there's been very little focus given to those, whereas I think it's increased the impetus around those. And then on the impact side, we definitely seen, we're already doing several pieces of work where we're looking at responses to COVID around job growth, local economic development. So it's also put a highlight on that positive impact that your investments can have and driving meeting certain societal needs or challenges.
Yeah, so I think it's both at the risk and the opportunity end of the spectrum. I think it's, COVID has made us realize how fragile our organizations and our societies are. So, how you need to be more alive to risks and how they impact your organization, but also how investors can, through being more intentional and focused on things like, as Kenny says, job creation, local economic growth, how we can respond to crises, which I think has been really encouraging to see.
Okay, thanks. Other question is, what is your view on the updated CRISA that was released last week?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't gone through it all. I had a brief look at it. Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that it's historically been targeting the listed space. And I'm not sure that, you know, the private markets needs another. Yeah, I mean, my overall opinion of frameworks is I don't think we need more. I think we need consolidation of what we have and consolidation into a framework that actually is taking lessons learned and driving efficiencies rather than adding more clout to what's already quite a complicated space.
Okay, Sarah, no response to that.
No, happy with Kenny's answer.
Okay, and I think the last
no offense to Chris or anything.
Okay,
I think it's a good initiative.
All right, we've got a minute, so if we can just, it's a pretty mouthy question, but if we can just limit it to a minute. Do you believe that users, in this case investors, of data have enough ESG data in order to appropriately evaluate and compare companies as potential investments? And how do you get over the fact that a lot of ESG data is not reported equally, as qualitative and at times subjective?
I think, I mean, yeah, I think that's, first of all, I think that we are moving to a place that is better than where we're coming from in terms of standardization of data. So I do think that, you know, the increased adoption of some of these standards, the more working together of some of these sort of standard providers, I think is really positive. I think that increased kind of pressure around transparency, accountability, reporting, etc., are meaning that there are kind of more standardized and better accepted approaches of gathering and reporting data. So I think we're moving in the right direction. But I think another important point to make is that it's always going to be really hard to compare apples with apples, because you always are dealing with different types of organizations working in different sectors, in different geographies, where there are going to be different things that are important. So it's not always relevant to talk about carbon emissions or water, or that's a bad example, but maybe you know, there are things that are going to be more or less material based on the sector that you're working in. So there's always, in my mind, going to be a level of subjectivity around those comparisons. They are kind of, you know, certainly amongst some organizations, a move towards trying to either monetize or quantify all of these things in a way that you can kind of very objectively compare one with the other. But I think what gets lost there is so many of the assumptions that go in on the back end. So I think my background is as a social scientist. So I, you know, I believe strongly that there's always a level of subjectivity. I think that qualitative data is really valuable, but I'm encouraged to kind of see the increased level of standardization and rigor around data gathering and reporting.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Kenny. Thank you so much to everybody who joined this webinar. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to some of the other questions, but if anybody would like to contact Sarah or Kenny, you can do so with the contact details on the slide that is shown currently. You can also catch them on their LinkedIn profiles. They're accessible from there. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow Ibis on Twitter. And thank you for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day to everybody. Goodbye.